If you have never stood at nearly 8,000 feet in the Montana high country in late October, you cannot fully understand what the air does to a person up there. It does not simply sit around you the way air does in the valley. It waits. It sharpens your eyes and wakes up something ancient in your blood. Mara knew this feeling better than she knew her own name. At 26 years old, she had become the master of Ironstone Ridge. Not because the ridge had been given to her, but because she had stayed when everything else left. Her husband Eli had been gone 2 years now. 2 years since the grief had settled into her bones like the cold, permanent and quiet. She had her cabin, her herbs, her garden, and Chester the one-horned goat who ate her drying shirts and grumbled at her judgment. She had the rhythm of solitude. She had made her peace. What Mara did not know, what she would not know until a carriage rolled up her trail and a name fell out of a stranger's mouth like a stone dropping into still water, was that her peace had been stolen from her deliberately. 2 years before the story begins, her husband Eli had owned the lower trail rights to Ironstone Ridge, rights that a man named Edmund Crest needed badly for his cattle expansion north. Edmund had not come himself. Men like Edmund never came themselves. He had sent lawyers and notices in a campaign of quiet legal pressure that wore Eli down over 18 months until the fight went out of him entirely. Eli died 4 months after he signed the papers. The doctor called it a weak heart. Mara called it a broken one. She had never connected a name to what happened. She only knew that one day Eli had land and dignity, and the following spring he had neither, and then he was gone. She had kept the last eviction. Notice the Crest men left nailed to her door. She had kept in a tin box under her bed the way you keep a thing you do not fully understand yet, but know you will need someday. She did not know why she kept it. She kept it anyway. On this particular afternoon in late October, the birds went silent all at once. The chatter of the jays, the call of the nuthatches, cut off mid-sound as if the sky had simply changed its mind about noise. Mara straightened up from gathering the last of the season's rose hips and looked west. The smell hit her first. Not rain. Iron. Cold and metallic and sharp. The smell of a freeze so deep it could crack stone. She whispered to herself that it was too early. The big snows didn't usually come until November. But the mountains do not own a calendar, and they have never cared about human schedules. She moved quickly. There was no panic in it, only the practiced efficiency of a woman who understands stakes. She ushered Chester into a shed and bolted the door against the rising wind. She stacked split wood high on the porch near the door. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes. The first flakes came sideways, hard little pellets of ice that stung the skin like thrown gravel. She was just reaching for the iron latch of her cabin door when she heard it cut through the roar of the gale. Not a coyote, not a mountain lion. The frantic trap cry of a horse, an animal in genuine distress, tangled somewhere below the ridge in the ravine that dropped off the eastern edge of her property. Most people would have closed the door. The storm was thickening by the second, the whiteout nearly complete, and the trail down into that ravine was treacherous even on a clear summer afternoon. But Mara was a healer. She had learned from her grandmother that a healer cannot selectively answer cries for help based on the weather. She grabbed her heavy buffalo hide coat, wound a wool scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, took a coil of rope from the hook by the door, and lit a storm lantern she already knew would be nearly useless against the coming dark. She stepped off the porch and sank immediately into ankle-deep snow. Foolish woman, she muttered to herself, and kept walking. She tied her rope to a sturdy pine at the top of the ridge and descended. It was a nightmare of slipping and sliding, icy branches whipping at her face, her boots searching for purchase on hidden rocks beneath the snow. When she finally reached the bottom of the ravine, the snow was drifting deep against the boulders. The horse, a terrified bay gelding still tangled in the traces of an overturned wagon, was thrashing and screaming in the white dark. Mara moved to it first, cutting the leather traces with her knife to free the animal. It scrambled up shivering violently but stood still, too exhausted to run. It was then that she saw the shape and the shadow of the overturned wagon. A young man, perhaps 28, sitting with his back against an ancient pine root, dark hair matted by snow and wind. Motionless, eyes closed, face pale and stark as carved stone. He was not wearing a coat. In a killing blizzard at 8,000 feet, the man had on only a thin cotton shirt, soaked through and clinging to his skin. His lips were blue. Mara dropped to her knees in the snow and crawled into the shelter of the tree. "Mister," she said, "can you hear me?" His skin was like marble when she touched his shoulder. Then she looked at what he was holding. He had wrapped his heavy woolen coat, his only warmth, around two small bundles pressed against his chest. With careful, desperate hands, with the particular clumsiness of a man working with fingers that had stopped feeling an hour ago, Mara peeled back the collar of the coat. Two pairs of terrified dark eyes looked up at her. Twin girls, no more than 5 years old, huddled together against their father's frozen chest, clinging to his soaked shirt. One of them, dark tangled curls, a small trembling hand, reached out and touched Mara's glove. "Papa won't wake up," the child whispered, her voice barely a sound above the screaming wind. "He gave us his coat. He said he was burning up." Mara felt a tear freeze on her own cheek. She pressed two fingers to the man's wrist. There, faint as a whisper, a pulse. Thready, weak, but there. She looked at the darkening sky. She looked at the girls. She looked at the icy slope above her and the mile between the ravine and her cabin. "He's not gone yet, little one," she said. Her voice came out fierce with surging strength she had not felt in 2 years. "And I will be damned if I let the winter take him now." She began to work. Getting them out of that ravine was the hardest physical thing Mara had ever done in her life. She fashioned a crude drag sled from 2 shattered planks of the wagon, lashing them together with a rope. Getting the man's dead weight onto it took every ounce of grit she possessed. She used the leverage of the snow, rolling him inch by inch, gritting her teeth until her jaw ached, fighting the numbness spreading through her own fingers. The girl she tucked against her own body as she pulled, tying the rope around her waist and digging her boots into the frozen slope one agonizing step at a time. People in the valley often talked about the strength of men in the West, men who could wrestle steers and break horses. But there is no strength quite like that of a woman who has decided that death will not have its way today. The wind tried to shove her back down. The ice tried to steal her footing at every step. But Mara was a daughter of the high country, and she knew how to breathe through the burn. She knew that if she stopped, even for a moment, the mountain would claim them all. It took an hour to move a distance that should have taken 10 minutes. When she finally kicked the cabin door shut behind them all, the silence was sudden and shocking. The roar of the gale cut off completely, replaced by the crackle of the fire she had banked earlier, the deep, warm smell of sage and dried mint and pine sap. She did not collapse. She did not allow herself even a single minute to catch her breath. The healer took over from the woman and got to work. For the next 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin in 4 feet of snow. The drifts climbed halfway up the window glass and sealed the world inside a white silence that was absolute and complete. Inside, a different kind of battle was being fought. The man, Andrew, was a name he whispered before the fever took him, though she would later learn his full name was Caleb, and the surname Cress would mean everything to her when it finally came, burned with heat. She found the cracked rib quickly, a purple, ugly bruise blooming across his side where the wagon had struck him when it tumbled into the ravine. Every breath he drew was a jagged shard of pain. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips every few hours, changing cool rags on his forehead, keeping the fire roaring at a constant steady heat. She did not sleep. Not really. She dozed in the armchair in 20-minute stretches and woke at every change in his breathing. This was the work. This was what being a healer actually meant. Not the gentle gathering of herbs in the autumn sunshine, but the grinding, stubborn refusal to let the worst outcome win. But it was the twins who broke her open in a way she had not expected. Wren and Sage, 5 years old, dark, soulful eyes too large for their small faces, still wearing the coats their father had not given away to keep them warm. For 2 full days they did not speak a single word. They sat huddled together on the bearskin rug near the hearth like 2 wild things that had been caught and were still deciding whether the trap was permanent. They watched Mara with the unblinking, wary intensity of children who have seen the worst thing they can imagine and are not yet certain the danger has passed entirely. They tracked her every movement. When she came too close, they pressed together tighter. Mara recognized it. She had seen the same thing in wounded animals. The best thing you could do was give them space and warmth and let them come to their own conclusion in their own time. She did not push. She filled the cabin with warmth instead of questions. She set a heavy cast iron pot over the fire and filled it with dried venison and wild onions and sage until the smell, rich and savory and grounding, the smell of safety itself, began to work on the room the way a slow medicine works on a body, gently and without force. She hummed as she worked. Not a song with words, just a low, steady melody her grandmother had hummed over her when she was very small and frightened of the dark, a sound that carried no demand in it whatsoever, a sound that said only one thing, over and over, "You are safe here. You are safe. You are safe." On the second evening, while the wind rattled the shutters hard enough to shake dust from the rafters, Mara sat in her rocking chair, mending one of the girls' torn dresses. She spoke to the room without looking at them directly. "This cabin used to get awful lonely during a storm," she said softly. "I used to think the wind was trying to tell me scary stories." She saw Wren's head tilt slightly toward her voice. "But then," Mara continued, her needle flashing in the firelight, "I learned that the wind is just looking for a place to rest. Same as us. It howls because it's cold and it has nowhere to go. But in here, the fire scares the cold away." She looked up and caught Sage staring at her with solemn, enormous eyes. The little girl was clutching a ragged piece of blanket against her chest. "Are you hungry, little bird?" Mara asked. Sage gave a tiny, jerky nod, barely a movement at all. Mara ladled warm broth into 2 tin cups, carried them to the edge of the bearskin rug, set them on the floor within easy reach of both girls, and stepped back without a word. It was an offering, not a command. There was a long pause. Then slowly, carefully, as if testing whether the ground would hold, the girls crept forward and wrapped their small hands around the warm cups and drank. As the broth hit their empty bellies, the fear began, just barely, just at the outermost edge, to melt. Later that night, Mara was standing at the stove stirring the embers down to a slow, safe burn when she felt a small weight press against her leg. She froze completely. She looked down. Little Sage had drifted over in the drowsy half-sleep of an exhausted child, and without asking for anything at all, she had simply wrapped her small arms around the heavy wool of Mara's skirt and pressed her cheek against Mara's thigh. She had found the safest thing in the room. She was holding on. Mara did not move. She stood there for a full hour, her leg cramping badly, while the child slept anchored against her. And the hollow place inside Mara's chest, the one that had been empty since Eli died, since the land was taken, since the grief settled in and made itself permanent, began, very slowly and quietly, to fill. What Mara did not know in that moment was that Wren had not fallen asleep at all. The older twin lay perfectly still on the bearskin rug with her dark eyes wide open, watching her sister and watching Mara and watching the firelight move on the ceiling and thinking the careful thoughts of a 5-year-old who has already decided something important. When the crow trackers arrived 4 days later and asked the girls gentle indirect questions over shared food, the patient way that trackers gather truth, it was Wren who spoke first without any hesitation at all. "She is our mama now," Wren said. "My sister already knew it. She just said it with her arms before she had the words." The trackers exchanged a look. They had their answer before they ever knocked on the cabin door. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Mara was grinding coffee when she heard the shift of fabric from the bed in the corner. She turned to see Caleb trying to sit up, his hand flying to his injured ribs, his face going white. "Easy," she said, crossing the room quickly. "You've got a cracked rib and a fever that only just decided to leave you be. If you fight gravity today, gravity will win." He slumped back against the pillows, breathing hard. His eyes cleared and focused on her, dark, intelligent, framed by 3 days of exhaustion and something else underneath she could not name yet. "My girls," he rasped. His voice came out rough and urgent. "They're safe," Mara said. "Fed, warm, and currently teaching Chester the goat to eat pine needles from their hands." He let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He looked at his daughters sleeping on the bearskin rug, and the expression that crossed his face was so raw and unguarded that Mara turned away to give him a private moment with it. The storm had broken. Outside the cabin wall's ironstone ridge was buried and brilliant and utterly silent. The kind of silence that only comes after a big snow when the world is covered over and made new. The sun came out dazzling and sharp on the fresh drifts. And inside, a new kind of weather was moving in. The particular atmospheric pressure of two people beginning to really look at each other for the first time without the emergency to distract them. Caleb's strength returned fast. He was not a man built for stillness. Within a week of the fever breaking, he was restless in the way of someone whose body and habits are in fundamental disagreement with idleness. Mara noticed things about him as he recovered and filed them quietly away without comment. His calluses were wrong. A working ranch hand goes rough across the full palm from years of gripping tools and reins. Caleb's calluses were at the fingertips, the specific roughness of a man who had spent years turning pages, writing by lamplight, pressing ink. His shirt, once washed and hung to dry by the fire, was fine cotton, not the rough-spun wool or canvas that the trappers and prospectors who usually came through Ironstone Ridge wore as simple practicality. He spoke like a man who had read books in a library and understood what he was reading. His voice carried an easy, educated cadence that had nothing to do with the high country and everything to do with a life that had included formal schooling and rooms with real walls. She asked him about the debt once, carefully, giving him space to tell the truth if he wanted it. He told her it was financial. A debt he could not pay with the currency they were demanding. He looked at the floor while he said it, and the lies sat so visibly uncomfortably on his face that Mara had to look away to spare them both the awkwardness of watching it fail. She was a woman of the frontier. She understood that everyone up here was running from something. She was not going to pry the lid off his secrets while he was still too weak to stand without wincing. Men ran from debts. That was true. But men running from money collectors did not look at their sleeping daughters with that particular desperate heartbreaking adoration that lived in Caleb's eyes every time he watched them. Men running from money did not hold themselves with that rigid ingrained dignity. Like a man who had been taught from childhood that how you carry yourself in hard circumstances is the truest measure of your character. She filed it away and let it rest. About a week after the storm, Mara woke before dawn to a sound she had not heard since Eli died. Thwack, 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 the rhythmic solid crack of a splitting maul finding pine. She crossed the window and looked out. Caleb was there in the cold gray pre-dawn light, breath pluming in great white clouds, working through the entire backlog of logs she had not gotten before the storm hit, and doing it with fluid, easy grace that said his body knew hard physical labor, even if his hands and his speech said something more complicated. Later that same afternoon, she found him on the roof. "What in heaven's name are you doing up there with a cracked rib?" she called up, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun on the snow. He looked down and grinned, the grin of a boy caught stealing pie. "That leak above your herb-drying rack." He called back, "Found some spare shingles in the shed. It won't drip anymore." She stood with her hands on her hips, trying to be properly annoyed. She was not annoyed. She felt something else entirely, a strange tight feeling in her chest, the particular sensation of a burden lifting that you had forgotten you were carrying in the first place. Inside the cabin, Wren and Sage had come fully alive. The silence of the first days was completely gone, replaced by small feet on floorboards and laughter cascading down from the loft. They followed Mara everywhere. They helped her sort dried beans, held the yarn while she wounded, asked her the names of every herb on every shelf with the relentless focused curiosity of 5-year-olds who had decided that knowing everything is the most important available activity. Caleb sat in the armchair in the evenings with a book resting forgotten on his knee and watched his daughters become themselves in a way they apparently had not been permitted to be before, wild and questioning and entirely unpolished. An expression on his face while he watched them was the closest thing to peace Mara had seen on him since he first opened his eyes. One evening the fire was crackling low, casting long dancing shadows on the log walls. The girls were exhausted and asleep in the loft. Mara was at the heavy oak table with her mortar and pestle, grinding dried comfrey roots into a poultice. The roots were tough and fibrous, and her hands were stained deep green and brown from the plant juices, her knuckles red and rough. She felt eyes on her and looked up. Caleb was watching her hands. "I'm making a mess," she said self-consciously, reaching for a rag. "It's not very ladylike work, I suppose." Don't wipe it away, he said quietly. He stood and walked to the table, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. Those hands of yours, he said. His voice was low and unhurried. They pulled my daughters from the snow. They stitched me back together. They chop wood and fix roofs and turn bitter roots into medicine. He reached out and covered her rough stained hand with his own, his palm warm and completely steady. Some hands are made for wearing diamonds, Mara, he said, meeting her eyes. Yours are made for saving lives. I know which kind I prefer. The air in the cabin seemed to leave the room entirely. It was not a compliment about her appearance. It was a compliment about her soul. It was the kind of thing a woman waits a lifetime to hear from someone who actually means every word of it. For a long, quiet moment, she let herself imagine it. This man, this life, the sound of those girls on the floor above, the fire, the smell of sage, all of it staying. But the snow always melts. And some debts are not financial at all. Some of them go much deeper than gold. If this story is landing on your heart right now, do not scroll past. Subscribe to Echoed True Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Chapter 4 is coming, and will change everything you think you know about who this man really is. The thaw came, and with its shadows settled over Caleb that no amount of firelight could reach. The warmth that had been building between them through the weeks of the storm and the recovery pulled back behind a wall that went up almost overnight. He stopped joking. He stopped sitting in the armchair with forgotten books on his knee while the girls ran circles around the cabin, and Chester the goat bleated at the door. He stood at the window for hours now, his hand resting absently on his pistol belt, watching the tree line at the edge of the clearing with particular quiet dread of a man who knows the shape of what is coming and has already calculated whether he can outrun it one more time. The answer written in his face was no. We have to leave, he told her one night. Tomorrow, before the mud gets too deep and the trail closes again. You're barely healed, she said. Your rib has not had 6 weeks yet, and the girls just started sleeping through the night without waking up crying. He cut her off cleanly. His voice was tight and measured, and nothing like the voice that had covered her working hands with his own and said something true by firelight. The people looking for us will not stop, Mara. If they find us here, I will not bring that trouble to your door. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded without arguing further. The lie was thinner now. She could see the cracks in it clearly. Men do not watch tree lines with a pistol hand for debt collectors. Debt collectors sent letters and lawyers. They did not send the kind of thing that made a man stand at a window in the dark, watching the shadows between the pines with that specific, calculating alertness. She packed them food anyway. She dried extra venison and wrapped it in cloth. She sewed careful, slow patches onto the girls' coats by firelight, taking her time with the stitching the way you take time with the thing you want to hold. The next morning was crisp and clear and brilliant, the kind of Montana morning that makes a whole world look like something worth fighting for. Caleb had spent 2 evenings repairing the wagon with scavenged wood from the shed. Good, clean work. The work of a man who had learned somewhere that things worth keeping were worth fixing properly. They were loading the last of their few belongings when it happened. Not thunder, not the sound of horses, not shouting. A single twig snapping in the pine forest at the edge of the clearing, the kind of sound that is too deliberate to be an animal. Mara spun and had the rifle leveled at the tree line before the echo died. Get the girls inside, she said. Her voice was flat and certain. Caleb did not move. She looked at him. He was standing beside the wagon with his face draining of color in a way that was not fear exactly. It was a particular expression of a man who has been running for weeks on nothing but will and has just felt that will run out of road beneath him. It's too late, he said quietly. His voice had gone completely still. From the shadows of the pine forest, 3 figures emerged. They moved with the silent, fluid grace of men who had been covering hard mountain terrain for many days without slowing. Crow Nation trackers in buckskins and wool, the practical layered garb of men who spend weeks in the high country and know exactly how to keep themselves alive in it. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders, not raised. The lead tracker was a man with silver streaks running through his dark braids, a face weathered like old saddle leather, eyes that had spent decades reading country and weather and the faces of people under pressure. He stopped in the clearing and looked at Mara's rifle and gave a very small, almost imperceptible nod. The specific acknowledgement of a man who respects a person standing their ground properly. Then he looked at Caleb, and he bowed. Not mockingly, not with ceremony. It was the quiet, formal bow of a man who was raised to honor the person he is addressing regardless of the circumstances of the meeting. "Young master," the tracker said, his voice carried easily and without effort across the clearing. "Your father has been waiting. The whole valley has been turned upside down. Come home." Mara lowered the rifle slowly. "Young master." She looked at Caleb. He was not looking at the trackers. He was looking at her, and the shame in his eyes was a specific kind that comes not from having done wrong, but from having kept a truth from someone who deserved it. The name she had been calling him was not wrong exactly, but it was not all of it. "My name is Caleb," he said. His jaw worked once. "Caleb Crest. My father is Edmund Crest of the Crest Valley Empire." The Crest Valley Empire. The name landed in Mara's chest like a stone dropped from a great height into still water. Edmund Crest. The name on the lawyer's letters. The name on the notices nailed to her door 3 years ago. The campaign of polite, unstoppable legal pressure that had worn Eli down through 18 months until fight left him, and then the life left him 4 months after that. Edmund Crest, who had wanted the lower trail rights to Ironstone Ridge for his northern cattle expansion, and had not come himself, had never come himself, had sent lawyers and papers and the grinding machinery of a large empire bearing down on one small man until the man buckled. Edmund Crest, who had taken Eli's dignity piece by piece and his life piece by piece, without ever once learning either their names. She felt the blood leave her face in a cold rush, then slowly come back. She said nothing. She breathed through it the way she breathed through hard climbs. Steadily, deliberately, not allowing shock to become the thing that was in charge. Caleb told her all of it then. His father had arranged for Wren and Sage to be sent to a boarding school in Boston at 5 years old, to have their heritage and wildness and everything that made them themselves scrubbed carefully away until they became what Edmund Crest called proper. He had arranged a marriage for Caleb to the daughter of a railroad man, a merger designed to push the empire further north along the exact trail that Eli's rights had once protected. Caleb had taken his daughters in the night and simply run. He had chosen a Montana blizzard and an unknown ridge over his father's careful architecture of obligation. "I could not let him send them away," Caleb said, his voice cracking open on the words. "I could not let him turn them into strangers to themselves. I could not let them grow up not knowing what they were." Mara stood very still. She looked at the lead tracker, who was watching her with the patient, steady eyes of a man who has already heard children answer quiet questions honestly and knows exactly how this story ends regardless of what the adults decide. She looked at Wren and Sage standing at the cabin door in their carefully patched coats, watching the adults in the clearing the way children watch things that are too large for them to fix, but that they understand completely. She thought about Sage pressing her cheek against her leg in the dark. She thought about Wren's voice. "She is our mama now. My sister already knew it." She thought about a tin box under her bed and a notice she had kept for 3 years without knowing why. She went inside. She opened the tin box. She folded Edmund Crest's eviction notice once and put it in her coat pocket. She came back out. She looked at Caleb. "I will come with you," she said. Nobody drove a carriage up Ironstone Ridge. The trail was built for mules, for rough wagons, for boots. A carriage was a folly. It was a statement. When the shiny black lacquered beast with silver lamps and velvet seats appeared around the bend of the trail, pulled by sweating black horses, Mara understood immediately what kind of man Edmund Crest was. He was the kind of man who forced his way into the wilderness because he could, because he had always been able to, because nobody had ever made it cost him anything. Edmund stepped out first, a mountain of presence if not a size. Heavy coat with a fur collar, silk cravat, boots that shone like oil, the hard-etched face of a man whose orders had been obeyed without question for 30 years. He did not look at the mountains. He looked at his son. Then Constance Crest descended the steps with a practiced grace, holding her skirts away from the mud, beautiful in a sharp, careful way. Her eyes swept the clearing, the goat shed, the woodpile, the small garden, and landed on Mara. Cold clinical assessment. No kindness in it at all. Edmund reached into his heavy coat, without preamble, and produced a leather pouch. It clinked heavily as he held it out toward Mara. "You're the widow who took them in," he said. His tone was that of a man settling an account. "This should cover your trouble. Perhaps buy you a new roof. Consider it payment for services rendered." Mara looked at the pouch. Something cold moved through her. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. She had seen this before. This was how Edmund Crest moved through the world. He put a number on things. He paid and walked away. He had done it to Eli. He was doing it to her now. Then Constance made a small, sharp sound. She was staring at the leather pouch in Edmund's outstretched hand with an expression Mara could not immediately read. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to the expression of a person watching something they built with their own hands being used against them, because Constance recognized that pouch. She had filled it herself. For years she had quietly set money aside, savings hidden from Edmund, a private fund she had built in secret for the day Caleb might need to walk away from the Empire and have something real to walk toward. Edmund had found it, and now he was using her love for her son as an instrument of dismissal against the woman her son had chosen. Constance went very still. For the first time in 30 years, she took one small step away from her husband's side. "I didn't do it for gold," Mara said. Her voice was quiet and level, the voice of a woman who has been building toward this moment without knowing it. "I pulled them out of the snow because they were dying. I fed them because they were hungry. You cannot pay for that, Mr. Crest. Not with all the gold in your bank." Edmund frowned at her, as though she were speaking a foreign language. "Enough of this," Constance said. But the sharpness had gone out of her voice, and something else was moving in beneath it. "Where are the children?" The cabin door creaked open. Wren and Sage stepped out in their patch coats. Mara had stitched those patches carefully, taking her time, wanting them to last. Constance opened her arms wide and put on a smile and called to them. "Sweets in the carriage, warm blankets. Come away from that dirty place." Edmund commanded. The girls froze. They looked at the black carriage. They looked at the stiff, wealthy strangers who claimed to be their blood. Then they looked at Mara. They ran, not to their grandmother, not to the carriage. Rose, Sage, hit Mara's skirts a full sprint and buried her face in them and held on with both arms. Wren grabbed Mara's hand and pulled hard toward the cabin door. "No go," Wren said, her small voice ringing out across the clearing with an authority that silenced every adult in the yard. "Stay with Mama Mara. Stay." Constance's arms were still open, embracing nothing but cold air. Edmund's face darkened. He turned on Caleb. The veneer of polite transaction was gone. "Get in the carriage," Edmund said. "You are the heir to the Crest Valley Empire. You have a duty to your blood. You do not belong here in the mud with a peasant herbalist. Get your daughters and get in the carriage now." Caleb looked at his father. Then he looked at Mara, standing there defiant and protected with his daughters wrapped around her legs, as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. He had seen her drag 3 people up a cliff face in a wide-out blizzard. He had seen her stand at a stove for 72 hours without sleeping. He had seen her set broth on the floor, within reach of 2 traumatized children, and step back and wait without demanding anything in return. He took a step, not toward the carriage. He placed himself directly in front of Mara and his daughters and turned to face his father. Then Mara reached into her coat pocket and held up the eviction notice. She held it steady, facing Edmund. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. "Your lawyers left this on my door 3 years ago. Mr. Crest," she said, "my husband Eli owned the lower trail rights to this ridge. You needed them for your northern expansion. You sent notices until he had nothing left to fight with. He died 4 months after he signed your papers. The doctor called it a weak heart. I called it something else." The clearing went absolutely silent. Edmund stared at the notice in her hand, then at her face. Then something in his own face shifted. Not remorse exactly, but a particular expression of a man who has been moving through the world at speed and has just been shown the wreckage he left behind without ever looking back. Constance looked at the notice. Then she looked at her husband. Then she reached out and took the leather pouch from his hand and walked across the muddy yard and held it out to Mara herself. Her voice was very quiet. "This was meant for Caleb," she said. "It was always meant to help him build a real life." She glanced once at her husband. "I think he has found one. Take it, please, not as payment. As a mother's apology for what this family cost yours." Mara looked at the pouch in Constance's hands for a long moment. Then she took it. Edmund climbed back into the carriage alone. His movements were stiff, the movements of a man who has just discovered that the ground he stands on is not as solid as he believed. "Drive on," he told the driver. His voice was quieter than anyone had heard it. The black horses surged. The carriage thundered back down the trail and disappeared around a bend of the ridge. Constance did not get back in the carriage. Caleb found Mara standing at the porch railing reading it. The mountain spread out before her in the late afternoon gold. He stood beside her and read it over her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. Then, "What do you want to do with it?" She folded the deed carefully and held it against her chest and looked at the ridge that had been hers, that had been taken, that had come back. "I want to build something on it," she said. "Something that lasts." They did. The richest man on the mountain was not the one with the empire after all. It was the one who found the woman with the healing hands. And the wisest thing he ever did was stay. Echoed True Stories. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Echoed True Stories so you never miss a story about the kind of justice that arrives quietly and stays forever. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.